Hey, man.
We're back. We're
We're back.
back.
Awesome. Yeah. So today, what are we doing? We're doing a little bit of road mapping. We're planning out the scope of this thing a little bit. So it'll give us a chance to talk about what we're building and kind of pick apart the pieces a little bit, make them into manageable chunks.
Yep.
So we talked a little bit last time about the modeling and what we plan on doing there, but I thought we could just pull up the example of, maybe Dribble. Let's just start modeling it out and figuring out what we need for the back end. So here, let me just pull this up right now. I'm going to do Dribble's job board. And yeah, let's just see what we got. So from your perspective, I don't know how you like to work. Do you like to start with the models, or do you like to look at like routes and views and stuff like that? How do you think about things?
Almost every single time go straight to the models. Because that I like to think about like this page, for example. Like, I'm going to need to collect information about the company and the location, and it gives me ideas of like what data I'll need to store. And then depending on how the UI works, I'm gonna end up with different routes and different controllers and stuff to save that. Like for the location, for example, maybe you're like hitting some service to like take an IP, or you can do all kinds of things. You could like use the IP address for the user and figure out their rough location from the IP, and then you can also go and use a Google Places API and whatever else. So like that UI stuff I end up doing second, because first off, I roughly know what I need to store and how to organize it, and then that um, makes it flexible for me to do the UI a bit, and I don't have to rewrite stuff if I decide to change how it works. So that's kind of the way I end up doing it.
It's funny because it's I typically start with the views. I'm probably more of a designer in that way. So I come from the views. I look at like a page like this and I'm like, oh, okay, so we're gonna need a jobs index for
Yep. Yep.
like the tenant, whatever the tenant is. And then we're gonna need, a jobs show page, like something like this. And then I kind of like pick apart the pieces on the page. And then I do think about modeling a little bit, but it's funny because I think about like routing and views like first. It's like, okay, so
Mm-hmm.
what are the main pieces of this thing? It's like, okay, so on the public side, there's going to be a view for the index, and then a view for the show, and then maybe an application or just like links out to those things.
Yep. Yeah.
Then from the admin side, what do we have for views? So we have like a creation of a new listing, and then probably some account management. Like I've never completed a job on Dribble, but I've done it on other sites. And so you have a profile of a listing of all of your jobs, like once logged in, like the active ones,
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
archived ones, whatever. So we'll have to kind of model some of those things out. But it's funny, man. It's interesting to hear how other people do it. So it's like,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I think what's cool is like it doesn't really matter. Like you're ultimately going to get to the same place, but it's going to.
Right. And I should say, like, I need some idea of what the views will look like before I can pull out any of the database stuff. So I guess I really do end up doing it similarly, where I'm like, you know, we have to look at the jobs index and the show and the new on Dribble, but that'll give me like the first thing I'm thinking about. I'm looking at this and being like, okay, there's titles, and the locations on the index page show like anywhere, remote, and they kind of like little tags. And I can
Mm-hmm.
tell that they're pulling that from like this location data that they ask for. And I'm like, the way I'm analyzing this is I'm like seeing the form's collecting this, but they're displaying it in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like they collect this and then just straight output it the same way. They're tweaking that. And so yeah, I guess I do need some of the rough view information, but it's mostly around like what data is there. Because I feel like a lot of times the UI is going to go get changed a million times as we experiment with what is actually um, intuitive for users. So
Yep.
I don't trust that the UI will look like what I'm looking at in the long run.
Yeah.
But I
No,
do know that the data is going to still be there.
yeah, so you're thinking about this like an architect, right? So you want to make sure
Yeah.
we get the right foundation, and that totally makes sense given like, all of your experience in programming and stuff. And I love that. So maybe what we can do is so we have this public roadmap that it's available, and I'll share the link in the video, but in the description. But let's map out then kind of what the scaffold needs to be. So I mean, we talked a little bit about the views, but let's just kind of map this out. So we have
Yeah.
here.
And a piece we haven't looked at yet that will influence this is like, if you are someone who created a job posting, we need a section for that, for you to manage it. So
Right.
maybe you fill the job posting and so on, and you want to take it down, or maybe you didn't and you want to extend it for another month or whatever, you know. So I think we'll have two categories of users, like people looking for jobs and people posting jobs. Don't
Yep.
you think?
Yeah. So we have the admin side of it, and then we have the public facing side of this. And then we also have to like figure out the multi-tenancy side of this too, which is if somebody is building this job board for their community, like how do they share that with them? Is this, going to exist on a subdomain,
Mm-hmm.
and those types of things. So I think some of the questions we need to answer here, maybe even before we get into the to-dos, is like, what is the scope of what we're building, like right now for Go Rails? So I know where this could go. There's a lot of places we could go and start doing all the payments of we're the marketplace and we're collecting all that stuff.
Yeah.
We had mentioned skipping that for the first V1 just to ship something. So let's just start with that first question, which is what are we building? What are we not building? Maybe, and,
Yeah. Yeah.
and figure that out. So when I ask you that question, what are we building actually? What's the first
So
thing?
I think the simple starting place um, that isn't the simplest, but it is pretty easy, is we can start with, you come to our site, JobBoardly.com, and you create your account for your job board. So like step one is create your job board, which is probably just like a name and a subdomain. Um, and then we can get into what's actually in a job board. Because if we start here, we can kind of think about multi-tenancy out of the box, where
Yep.
we can host multiple job boards in the same app. And the benefit of doing that is we don't have to go back and like have a database full of stuff and then try to safely rewrite it all so that it supports multiple job boards. Because if you built it where it only supported one job board and then you've got to go graft on your accounts and multi-tenancy and stuff, it's pretty tricky to do well. And I think it's safer to do this first. And then, of course, Jumpstart kind of gives us that functionality out of the box. So we don't have to build much. We can kind of skip a step in a way.
Yeah. So on this very first create account, we're coming from the admin side. So let me just like categorize this as admin or customer, right? So this is from the customer side. They're going to create a new account, and they can, put their subdomain on this account too. And this gives us the ability to do the multi-tenancy. Some people will do multi-tenancy with creating separate databases. I know with Jumpstart, we have this gem called Access Tenant, which we can kind of leverage to do some of the scoping for us, right?
Yeah, and really the design difference between the two is you can have truly separate databases, but that is really, really hard to manage, because if you have 1,000 databases and you got to add a table or a column to every one of those, it's kind of a nightmare, and it's not as scalable either. So the easier way of doing that, and what's recommended by like Citus, which is a very popular Postgres instance that you can buy that has multi-tenancy built in, they recommend row level multi-tenancy instead of database level. And that just means, when someone creates a job board, that's the tenant. And then every single record for job listings and users in there and everything like that, they all have the account ID on that record. So it's just automatically scoped to that. And it's just like scaling a regular old database that way, which is really nice. You just force this account ID in every query, and that's it. So it's very simple to work with and index and scale up, which is a good improvement.
Okay, cool. So now I know this is about as basic as it gets in terms of modeling, but so we're going to have, for sure, we're going to have jobs. So a job is going to be, consist of routes of like creating the job. So we're going to have a new, right? So we're going to have a new
Mhm.
one. We're going to have a show, which shows the job. We're going to have an index of all of
Probably
these.
have the typical CRUD, as you might have heard, like create. And CRUD is funny because it's like create is really two steps. It's new and create. Update is edit and update. And, you know, you need a form, but you need some action to actually do it. So yeah, if anybody's familiar with building web apps, they probably are familiar with all this. Cause yeah, I don't, in a lot of cases, I find models don't need the full CRUD, but in this one, you absolutely will. You know, the users who are browsing the site, they're only going to see the show and the index. But people who are posting jobs will see all of those because they're going to want to delete and update and, you know, change things, fix typos and whatever.
Is this going to kind of exist in the same routing pattern? So whether you're logged in or not. So let's just say you're logged in. Are they going to like? Is this going to kind of live under admin slash jobs and kind of or maybe
Right.
admin? Like, are we going to kind of have an admin area that's specific to like a different controller or something like that? That's just the create and the update.
I prefer to do that because if
Okay.
you reuse stuff, it just gets tricky. And, you know, like you want to have like a show page with an edit button and so on. And you know, if you put all that stuff together and you're checking is the owner logged in and viewing it or is it a guest, you just end up with kind of a lot of logic spread out. And we can have it a bit more organized and managed that way if we just have two jobs controllers in Rails, one for the public and one for the the whoever posts the jobs. I don't know what should we give that person a name, the employer side or something.
Yeah, I don't want to call it admin because this is kind of the admin we have in Jumpstart is a little bit like its own section. So it needs to have its own namespace. I don't know if
Yeah,
yeah, we want to call it a manager or lister
I
or
like manage like
manage.
that. Yeah,
Okay.
I like that a lot.
Yeah, so this is interesting. So what I like about this too is we're talking about CRUD and RESTful design, and this is something that I've like really leaned into a lot more lately, which is trying to make everything fit within RESTful design, like that like CRUD kind of way, and then to create controllers that are very specific. So in this case, like, yeah, we could keep all of this underneath one controller for sure, but it's nice to just like to create a nested controller. And we can get into this when we actually show some of the code behind it. But I love being able
Mm-hmm.
to like kind of break these out into very specific things because then you know what's going on. And then you never really break outside of CRUD,
Yep.
hopefully. You never break outside of like the normal CRUD operations. So,
Yeah, and a good example of that is like you may have a job post that is draft by default and you want to have a publish step and you could just tack that into the same jobs controller, but you can also have a manage jobs publish controller that just has one action to create and that does the publishing, and destroy there would do the unpublishing or moving it back to draft status. And it just makes it easy to manage your code as it gets more complex that way, I think.
yeah. And so if we get back to that first question of what are we building here, we know who we're building it for, which is community managers who are trying to build or create their own job board and facilitate those job listings. I think the first question I'd love to know too is will people use this thing? So for us to go as far as to add payments or anything like that to this, is a little premature. Like I know we have the pay gem we can use that comes alongside, comes along with Jumpstart, but anything around payments, we should probably hold off on. I think we want to focus on getting the job listing in, getting those fields in, getting that scaffolded, and getting like the front end designed so that those things can be listed. What else are we missing in this overall scope of like trying to ship something small just to get that first assumption made, which is people will list their jobs here? Like we want to see that happen.
Right. Well, I mean, I like to dig into what do we want to collect about a job,
Mm-hmm.
And even like the concept of do we have draft ones or not? Like if we were doing payments, I would say they're draft by default, and then the active paying becomes the publish step. But maybe if we don't do payments right now, maybe we just have a button that says publish, and just marks it as published, and only the published ones are visible. So I would probably have like that. Locations are another piece that's a little bit less straightforward too, because we have, like if you go back to Dribble, you'll see on the index there that there are some, or even on the form, it's like for every location, it can be on-site, but it could be entirely remote, and on-site or remote. But even remote is like, here's an optional location. And it's optional because it's like our headquarters is wherever, if it's Amazon, you could work remotely, but our headquarters is in Washington. So, you probably want some overlap in time zone or something. Like you don't want to be working in Australia where you're going to be working at night. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe they want someone to do support overnight, and, you're in the opposite time zone, which makes it perfect. So I like this where like job location is basically required, even if it's I guess it's like two types of locations. You have on-site, remote, or both, but also you have the actual location of city, state, country, as well. So it's storing these two things, not just one, even though this field looks like it's one thing.
Okay. So we want to make sure we capture some of those things on the back end. And so we can just model this out really quickly, actually, while we're on this call. Let me see here. And I might even fast forward through some of this stuff as like skip some of these things, but we have title.
Yeah, because this is what I like to do is kind of go through and say, yeah, we need title, description, we need location, like a high level location or whatever you want to call that, on-site or remote option. But then we need like an actual address as well.
Whoops.
Not a full address of street name and number, but
it's just like a string or something that people can kind of read through.
Something. And this can be useful if we're like eventually we want to add latitude and longitude, so we could show it on the map. That's not as likely, so we can skip that.
So this is an interesting one. So we have type, and we're gonna have a categories area. This gets back to this the two different people that are going to be using this product. You have the managers and the users. So on the manager side, we'll probably need a spot for categories of like type, right? Like this is a specific either job type.
Yeah, and this one's very specific to Dribble, which is only designers. In our case, is it more of is this one more of a role of, you could be a full-time marketer, you could be a full-time, or you could be a marketer, engineer, customer support, HR, that's like more the role that I think of. And then what they call role is like the type of job. It's not, I don't think it's really, you can reuse these words in whatever way you want, but to me, this is sort of the category of like, work full time. Like, I don't
Is
know
it
if
category though?
is,
Maybe it's
I don't think
category.
it could be category.
Because
Yeah.
that's kind of, I mean, so I think we work remotely. Let me pull that one up. I think that one's just like category. And then they have maybe subcategory. And what we could do is just have a category and then tags. And I know that's just a common pattern that we could leverage, but just the ability for people to filter things differently.
Yeah, I'm curious. I definitely agree that like
Yeah,
I think of
category.
role as the job title more than, or maybe we call it job title. Oh, this is interesting. Okay, they call it type for full time and contract. So we could have multiple job types,
Right.
and then category is probably useful so people don't have to make that up on the spot. You can just choose. See, I guess the reason they have the select for categories is because they have actual sections on their site for the
Mm-hmm.
categories. And most job boards do have that. Like, you're in business or marketing or HR, engineering, and so on. And they kind of group them together because if you're a developer, you don't want to see any of the customer support jobs. So maybe we model it off of this and do the job type, which is full time, part time. You know, I guess they consider contract as part time, maybe. Not sure. But we can have like, our examples in our rough mock-up of what the table will look like, because I think we'll probably want contract or freelance in there, and I would love for GoRails to have an apprenticeship job type. I
Yep.
would love that.
So this is where it gets into it again. So if we're talking about managers and users, so on the manager side, we're going to need, this is helping us see what we need. We're going to need job types here that are
Mm-hmm.
manageable, that have some defaults,
Yep.
and defaults to full-time and part-time maybe. Um, and then we're going to also need categories. So on the front end and the back end, and those will be populated then by the defaults and the custom data that the managers are creating. And maybe there are no defaults, I should say. So if they have categories, we show them. If they don't have categories, we don't show them. And that's kind of the way we do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Tags are an option. I don't even want to add those yet, actually, because that's just another layer of filtering that like it's just additional to the scope we don't need to have right now.
Yeah, and tags are an interesting one that like very quickly they become so vague and generic that it
Mm,
it just ends up messy. And I think if you can give it a, a purpose with a better name than tags, then they quickly become way more useful. Um, yeah, I like the how to apply. Is that go back up there? Is the how to apply? It's just a string field. It
yeah,
looks like.
because sometimes it's a link, or sometimes it's an email address.
Yep, I like
Um,
that
yep.
because they may have their own job posting somewhere or a contact form or something on their website, and they want you to use that. Or here's a jobs at, you know, JobBoardly.com email to contact or whatever. It makes it flexible just being a string.
Yeah, and so all this stuff, I think this is, I like that they are collecting at some point. I don't know if this is something I would collect right away. Personally, I would like to get somebody basically through the step of creating their job listing and then saying like, hey, now update your profile so that it becomes more appealing to people who are, job seekers. That's just my personal take on it. I would prefer for somebody who's onboarding in and like putting their job in here just to like, cool, you've got the progress of listing your first job. Next step, update your logo, add a company statement. I don't want them to get hung up in this step, essentially. Like I want them to like feel like they're making progress.
Yeah, and I think they only have three required ones: company name, website
Yeah.
URL, and email. Um, those are probably required, but also they're something that we can store on the manager profile as well. So like these happen to be fields in the same form, But if we save these fields on the manager's account, then they can post another job for the same company and it's pre-populated for the second job and so on. They wouldn't have to, because you can imagine that anybody who's posting is posting on behalf of one company, probably.
Yep.
Maybe wrong in the long term, but if we do set this up so that the first job you fill out, you put in the company name and the URL and email, and then we can just reuse that in the future. That will save them time and they can just publish more jobs. And even that leads into thinking about some things like, okay, you hired a senior Ruby on Rails developer 6 months ago. We can build a duplicate button and it will create a duplicate record of that. And here's your new job posting. And you
Yep.
can go tweak that if anything changed and so on. And that leads into a lot of those other ideas that we can build on later of like usability pieces.
One thing I like to think about with all of this stuff is what's the progress we're trying to help somebody make, and how can we get them there faster? How can we make them feel? I know this is a silly example because it's like a very simple form already, but it's like, I think somebody like Typeform has done a really good job of creating like this almost of a game like feel, not gamifying, but like game like feel into what they've done with forms, which is, you're just focused on this one thing. We're going to help you make progress as you go, so you're not overwhelmed by all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's just something I'm always thinking about now as somebody who loves user experience and UI and stuff. It's like, how can we help somebody feel like they're making progress and hide as much unnecessary stuff until the moment that we need it? That's going to help them make more progress. Like, okay, we've proven that somebody can post a job. Cool. Now let's show them how to make that job more attractive by putting in their logo, some company mission stuff. Maybe even like kind of stealing some of the ideas that, sites like Key Values or some of these other job boards that are more value driven can do. And like, now let's make it more appealing. Let's not make this so transactional. Let's help you like feel like you're actually making progress and you're like playing a game a bit. Mm-hmm. So I know that's a long-winded way of saying like, how do you make your forms more interesting? But the goal is really to get people to use your product. You want people to use this thing.
Yeah.
And in order for somebody to use our product, they have to have people who are posting jobs and like, successful with it. So how do we make people successful with that?
One of the strategies that I don't see used enough on that vein is, I'm trying to think of an example site that does this. Maybe it's probably something like Gmail, honestly. When you click new in certain apps, it will just create a new record in the database that's empty. And it doesn't have any validations of like, you have to have your job, your company name and your job title and whatever. It just creates a blank record that's marked as a draft. And I think we could do that. The only difference really between this and that would be, we would need the employer to actually register for an account first in order to do that, so we don't have a bunch of these empty records laying around. But it allows them to fill out just the title and just like leave it, and they can move on. And if they get distracted or like this other job posting is actually more important, or they just wanted to create a to-do almost in their app, you can do that with those records. And it also helps in that like wizard style of thing. Like, here's the only information you have to use to create this record. Then you can fill out one field or no fields or whatever, and turn it into something that they can progress through a little bit more gamified. And so that might be a cool thing to do on this. Because right now, if you were to go to Dribble or We Work Remotely, I think you have to fill out this whole thing and then submit. And then you probably lose it because they don't ask for an account.
Right. Yeah. Ideally, we store some of this stuff in a draft and we make it easy for somebody to come back to. Right. Like, so thinking ahead of the user, for me, a part of me is always thinking about the developer side of this. Like, oh, well, that's not clean, or that's not perfect, or whatever, or that's not tidy. But it's like, how can we think about this from the user perspective of like, yeah, start your ad or start your, your job post, come back to it whenever you want. It'll be there for you. Maybe we'll save a cookie for the, the active job that they're working on or whatever. But I love thinking about those things, because as simple as this seems, as simple as like a job board seems, there are all these like hidden complexities that go into it that I think are kind of fun to, pull on the strings a bit and just see like, yeah, like we can actually insert some more innovation here. There's some things we can do here that would be better for the user. So let's do those. Like we have the opportunity to build this from scratch. Let's do it better. And that's what's exciting to me about this project. It's not that like job boards are extremely exciting to me. It's just that we get a chance to build something that's hopefully a better experience for other users.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, like you can feel that smoothness of using an
Mm,
app that's thought about like, you might get distracted in the middle of this long form, and we're going to build it so that it's easy to come back to. But then there are the ones that are built very, very simply, and they're like, if you didn't fill out all of these things and get them all filled out correctly and pass all the validations, then we're going to like just lose it for you. We don't want that experience, and those are the little details that make something feel polished versus something that isn't. That's a
yeah.
big difference.
It's polished in the right areas, right? So we could spend weeks and weeks working on the UI and the design experience, or we could kind of work through the workflow experience, or you could work through the payment experience if you're really just trying to optimize for making money right away. And so for us, we know that in order for these job boards to work, to be successful for people who are trying to make money from them, they actually have to provide a good experience for people posting the job. So like that's such a core piece to focus on. And I think it's easy to get sidetracked by, oh man, let's just make our site look like Dribble and then everybody's going to use it. It's like,
Yeah.
well, I think stepping back a second and saying, what are we really trying to make sure we do well? And that's, can these job postings, which is a very like the core part of the whole thing, can we make that part really great? And because everything kind of hinges on that. And so I love this thinking, man, because I don't know if a lot of product developers think like this all the time, which is, just thinking through all these little things and putting the polish in the right places. And I'm hoping that those things add up for a product that feels great to our customers.
Yep. Agreed. Yeah, I feel like a lot of the time in development, you're worried about like, how do we get this going in general? And you get the bare bones working, but it's
Yep.
so much more useful if you are thinking about how can we make this smoother and just polish the rough edges out from the beginning. You don't have to do it from the beginning, but you can actually make some decisions along the way that's like, this will be a little clunky now, but it'll be easy for us to add that in the future when it matters. And like, coming back to the homepage here, the search section on the right side is actually really interesting to me, because you'll notice that this stuff doesn't match exactly what was on the other page.
Mm-hmm.
The remote friendly on or off. That's really interesting because when you are creating your job, it's like, where is it? On site? Do you allow remote? Is it only remote? And this is like, hey, if you're looking for a job, you just want to know if they're remote friendly or not. It doesn't matter if they're entirely remote or partially remote most of the time. You just want to know that you can work remotely. And there you go. You have that. And honestly, I think a tweak I would make is just turn it on by default. It's
Right.
2021. We're in a
Yep.
pandemic. Like it should be turned on by default, and it should be above the location probably. Like it's more
Yeah.
important these days than the actual location, I think. So, those little things of well, even look, the full-time and freelance contract, those are also toggles. And that's interesting to me because when you're building something, a lot of times you're like, oh, we'll just slap a select box on here and you can choose all full-time jobs, all part-time jobs, all contract jobs. And this is like, well, actually, you might want some of these, you might want to include some of these other ones, and we can let you customize it how you want it. And you're just hiding and showing certain types instead of like only looking at one at a time.
Yeah, I
Very,
think
very useful as a user looking for a job.
yeah. So we're playing like putting on our user hat right now and looking at the user experience on the other side. And so I do think it's all these little things, the nuance there, like you're talking about, remote friendly. We're in 2021. The pandemic has shifted most people to this remote first kind of workplace. And so it's like, yeah, it's all the little things that we can do from a user perspective, like a job seeker perspective, then on the other side, that are going to really make a difference too, like making sure that experience is great and all those kinds of things. So
You
it's,
know,
yeah.
I I just had a thought that just came to mind, and I was looking at this, analyzing like they have Dribble makes money when you post a job, right? So that if you go back up to the top, they have a big old banner of like post your job, and then on the left side there's a big old box. Here, you want to post a job here, and then at the bottom right of that search stuff, it's like, hey, you can post a job again. It's like really focused on they want to make their 249 a month, you
Yeah.
know. But as someone who's looking through jobs, it is daunting when there's like all these jobs. And I just had an idea of like, what if you could just like temporarily or whatever favorite a job of like,
Hmm.
oh, this one's interesting. And you just click a button and it adds it to a list of jobs that like, I might want to apply to, because if you go through this, you're going to end up with probably going to open each one of these that sounds interesting in another tab and try and read through them all and decide which ones to go through. But rather than like forcing you to use your browser to do that, like we could build something with a little button of like, you know, sounds interesting. And you click that and it just adds it to a list of ones you're considering
I love
applying
that. So
to.
we can, so a couple points. One, I love that you're talking about removing some of the nonsense that is promotion versus like helping the user find the jobs that they want. I think that's a huge insight because that the goal here, the person we're serving is not the person posting the job, it's the job seeker. So we gotta remove that. If we were just going to clone the dribble job board, we might miss that nuance. Okay, so I love that. Number two, I think you're right. I think this idea of like saving jobs, I think about this with car searching or whatever. Like, how can we improve this experience? It's not just like how can we clone what's out there. Like, how can we actually improve this experience from first principles? And so, something that drops into my head when you said that was how Hey does aside. So, set this one aside. And what if we have like just a
Mm-hmm.
simple action, just a boom, set it aside. When you set something aside, we're going to create a new profile for you in the background, and then we're going to associate you with this record, and set a cookie or whatever, and then start associating these jobs that you're setting aside. And what'll be kind of neat about that then is when you go and you finally create your profile or whatever you do, you're going to have all these things that you can refer back to. And yeah, man, again, I think that's a great insight where we might have missed it if we just went and copied and pasted what Dribble has done to Go Rails. And so these little innovations, they might seem like small tweaks, but to me, those are like the fun parts to focus on because not only are they different and they're like things that can help us position better, but they're just a better experience for the user. So it's kind of like, to me, it's the exciting part about building products. If you and I were just like, hey, let's just create a job board software, like
Mm-hmm.
okay, like, yeah, not that interesting. But when you talk about getting to first principles and creating a better experience, now we're talking, like that's kind of
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah, like you need to be able to put yourself in the shoes of your multiple types of users. And we really have two types, the employers and the job seekers. And I haven't done a lot of hiring people, so it's harder for me to put my shoes in that place. But like I can imagine it, but I can definitely imagine the nonsense that is trying to find a job. It's really hard because there are so many, and even like the top three jobs here, like one's a product designer, one's a digital designer. What does that mean? How's that different than a product designer? And then a marketing designer, but it's a junior. And I'm not interested in junior jobs.
Right.
So like I want to ignore that one. But these two, I need to like read the description to see what's the difference between them. Because they always end up with different wording, and it's hard to compare jobs. And that sort of ability to save them so you can compare them and read through them, and just like filter down this list is a feature that I feel like would be invaluable. um
Yeah.
you know
And none of this is persisted too. So like all the changes, right, that we're making here, basically if I refresh this, none of this is persisted. It's all going to flip back to whatever was, initially there. Again, I think it's something that we can do better, right? Like we can save some of this stuff in cookies in terms of like what their filters are, what their preferences are. So every time they come back to our site, they don't have to redo that every time. And so again, I think there are all these little things where if you look at something as simple as a job board, something that looks simple on the surface, there are lots of ways to improve on even some of the best things out there. So I don't know. I don't know if this is a good place to pause it. I know we got away a little distracted from our roadmap, which we can kind of fill in off camera as we go back to the scope. But I think this is just it's been a great conversation just to kind of talk through what are we building? Why are we building it? What's the experience we want to create? And kind of getting at these more strategic decisions that are not just about putting lines down, which is, coding is the easiest part. It's creating the right experience and finding the customers. That's the hardest part. So
yeah, I agree. And like if you jump back to Notion, like we'll have all these like concrete first version things that we need to go build, and then stuff like setting a job post aside is something we're not going to build in like the very first iteration.
yep.
But we'll have it in the back of our minds, and we don't need to map it out yet. That can be our second sprint. And we can just like write it down that we want to be able to set aside a job post to review later as a user. And I think I forget what do they call that? The uh oh shoot. When you define a sort of a use case like that, where you're like, I want to be able to do X as this type of user.
Like
Um
customer story or something like that. I
yeah,
don't
I
know.
think it's something like that. I want to have those in the back of our minds and like write them down. And then like the concrete absolutely required stuff is the things we need to focus on first, which I think we have a good list of them. Like this is pretty much all we need for the absolute bare bones. It won't be the best experience, but we can get version 1 done, and that's all we really need probably.
Yep. So next steps are kind of scaffold out some of these things now that we have them semi mapped out, scaffold them out, get them out and, ship something, get it going. And then we can actually start playing with the design, which we can kind of cover in the next one, whether that's, together or separate, however we start modeling this out with building in public. But super exciting. It's awesome just to kind of make progress on these things and to realize that progress is decisions too. It's not just code. Like there's a lot of things that progress is. And so yeah, it's been fun to catch up on this stuff. And I feel like we're headed in a good direction.
Yeah, I'm excited. So yeah, that gets us, I think, really close to just dive into code and start modeling this out.
All right, man. Sounds good. Let's chat soon. It's great catching up. Hopefully, if you're listening to this or watching this, hopefully you got something out of it. And yeah, we'll see you on the next one.
Yeah, sounds good. See ya.
Yeah.